Have you ever been humiliated in a place you had every right to be? Not because you were loud, or wrong, or undeserving, but simply because someone looked at you and decided you didn't belong. Maybe it was the cold stare of a receptionist who saw your skin before your smile. Maybe it was the security guard whose hand hovered near his radio when you walked through the door. Maybe it was the words unspoken but carved into the air. People like you shouldn't be here. For some, it's a moment they can brush off. For others, it's a wound that never truly heals. Because it's not about a seat, a room, or a table, it's about dignity. It's about being told, without hesitation, that you are an outsider in spaces you helped build, fund, or dream of entering. But what if, just once, the tables turned? What if the person they dismissed wasn't powerless? What if she had the ability to dismantle their arrogance not tomorrow, not in a courtroom, but right there, in front of every single witness? What if the woman they mocked as out of place turned out to be the one holding all the keys? This isn't a fantasy. 10 minutes. That's all it took for Naomi Reed, the black woman they tried to humiliate, to strip every ounce of false authority from those who thought they owned that lobby. 10 minutes to reveal who truly held the power. 10 minutes to turn public shame into public reckoning. And it all started the moment she stepped into the Aurora Grand Hotel. No assistants, no designer labels, just a woman in sneakers and a black t-shirt, walking into a lobby dripping with chandeliers and marble and being told to get out. So before we go further, I want to ask you, what would you have done if it were you? And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that quiet, cutting arrogance, hit that like button, share this story, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next exposed more than just 3 employees. It exposed an entire system. Naomi Reed stood in front of the towering glass doors of the Aurora Grand Hotel, her shoulders still damp from Seattle's rain. The morning was a dull gray, and droplets traced the line between the cold, unforgiving outside and the glittering luxury within. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. No assistant, no designer luggage, no obvious markers of someone who belonged. Just a tall black woman in a fitted black t-shirt, jeans, and a pair of worn sneakers. Charles Denton, the front desk manager, looked up from his monitor. His eyes swept Naomi from head to toe, not just to recognize her, but to assess her. It was the kind of gaze that filed people into categories. Then, in a voice as cold as the marble beneath her feet, he said, "Out? This place isn't for people like you?" It wasn't a mistake. He said it like a rule, like there was still a sign out front that read, "We don't serve people who don't look like us." His words carried across the gleaming lobby, silencing the velvet-upholstered guests in mid-conversation. Heads turned. A few people discreetly lifted their phones, not to help, but to record what they assumed would be a spectacle. Naomi stood still, her eyes calm. That calmness bothered Charles more than anything. He waited for her to snap, to argue, to plead, to get angry. But she didn't. Naomi walked to the front desk, placed a glossy black card and her ID on the counter, and said, "Check the reservation. Reed, Naomi Reed." Charles squinted, his face tightening into a mask of disdain. He picked up the card with 2 fingers, as though it might stain him. "Premium suite. Are you sure you booked the right hotel?" He didn't have to raise his voice. The people nearby could hear every word. Sabrina Lowe, the blonde receptionist, smirked knowingly. Someone nearby coughed, the sound sharp with judgment and curiosity. Naomi stayed silent. She didn't need to dignify the insult. "Flag this card. Fraud alert," Charles called out toward Sabrina, louder this time, like he wanted the entire lobby to hear. And just like that, the black card, a symbol of wealth and access, was locked away in a drawer like stolen property. Naomi stood there, composed, pulling out her phone. She spoke softly, almost as if to herself. It started. No one understood who she was talking to, but if they'd looked closely, they might have noticed the faint curve of her lips. It wasn't fear, it was the smile of someone who already knew how this would end. And that was what unsettled them most. Why would someone humiliated so publicly stand there like she was waiting to watch them fall? Charles snorted, his voice dripping with contempt. A premium suite. People like you don't belong in rooms like that. The words landed like a pebble in a still pond, but the ripples spread quickly. Sabrina chimed in, her voice coated in sugar but sharpened like a needle. We've had people like that before. They come in, pretend they booked, turns out it's stolen info. Naomi slowly turned her head toward Sabrina. Her gaze was steady, almost curious, as if to ask, "Do you hear yourself right now?" But she said nothing. Her silence was a mirror, forcing them to see themselves. Charles gestured for Sabrina to take the card away. She did it gently, like it was routine, but her eyes gleamed with smug satisfaction. The black card, a thing people dream of now treated like evidence in a petty theft case. The soft click of the drawer closing wasn't just about a card. It was the sound of them stripping her of dignity, of asserting, "Here, we decide who belongs." Naomi didn't blink. She looked straight at Charles and said, slowly, "So, you think this is how you protect the hotel?" Charles crossed his arms and leaned in, trying to reassert control. "I think this is how we protect our reputation. People like you, always trying their luck in places like this, but we're not so easily fooled." The lobby murmured with whispers. Two young vloggers, Tasha and Drew, had been holding their phones up for a while. "You see that," Tasha whispered, just loud enough for her live stream to catch it. "She hasn't lost her cool once." "Maybe she's used to this," Drew replied, eyes still on Naomi. A middle-aged man nearby shook his head. "She's handed over everything and they're still treating her like a thief. This is a kangaroo court." Naomi heard it all. She remained still, like a breathing statue. Their petty words slid off her like pebbles against steel. "I'll stand here," she said quietly, "until you do your job." Charles laughed dryly. "Do my job? I think you misunderstand. I decide whether you even get to set foot upstairs." Naomi tilted her head, her voice steady. "Do you? I thought the person signing your paycheck had that authority." A pause, like someone had just pulled the cloth off a hidden statue. Sabrina hesitated. Charles blinked slowly as if he'd heard something he wasn't supposed to. Naomi smiled, not the smile of someone humiliated, but of someone holding the upper hand. And then they would all understand why a woman stripped of her so-called power still hadn't stepped back. Naomi slid her phone out of her pocket. Not hurried, not secretive, just like a woman casually checking her schedule. She pressed a button, brought it to her ear, and said evenly, almost flatly, "It's begun." 3 words, but they hit the polished lobby like a stone breaking a calm pond, sending ripples no one could gauge. Sabrina raised her eyebrows, leaning toward Charles. "What did she just say?" Charles shrugged, crossing his arms tighter to mask the unease creeping in. "Just theatrics. People like that love an audience." But the crowd wasn't so easily dismissed. A few strained to hear. Tasha and Drew leaned closer, with Tasha whispering deliberately loud for her audience. "It's begun." "Begun what?" Drew chuckled, eyes locked on Naomi. "I don't know, but I feel like the game's about to flip." Naomi hung up, slid her phone back into her pocket, and lifted her chin. Her eyes swept the onlookers, then landed on Charles. Her voice was light, but it carried weight. "I'll wait." Charles smirked, feigning control. "Wait for what? The cops?" "No," Naomi replied evenly. "Wait to see how deep you're willing to dig this hole." A few gasps came from the onlookers. Sabrina turned away, masking her discomfort. Charles inhaled sharply, trying to regain ground. "You're just embarrassing yourself." Naomi tilted her head, her gaze cutting through his facade. "Are you sure about that?" The question wasn't meant for an answer. It was a scalpel, slicing through the false confidence he wore, and by the furrow of his brow, Charles had already answered. No one in the lobby fully understood what was happening, but they all felt it. This woman wasn't standing here to beg. She was standing here to witness. Drew murmured into his phone, addressing the thousands watching live. "She's not powerless. I don't know why, but she's playing this like she's already set up the board." Naomi kept that faint, knowing smile, the kind that belonged to someone who already owned the endgame. And in that moment, a few people in the lobby began to wonder, were they watching a public humiliation, or the prelude to a disaster that would rock the entire hotel? And soon, they would all know why those 3 simple words had made an entire luxury lobby hold its breath. Suspicious person in the VIP area, possible fraud. Charles enunciated each word deliberately, his voice loud enough for not just the receptionist to hear, but for the entire lobby to witness his little performance of authority. Sabrina, his obedient shadow, pressed the intercom, her tone as cold and sharp as a needle. "Security to the lobby, possible fraud." The words fraud and scam cut through the air like blades, leaving behind a strange, heavy silence. Guests waiting for their room keys turned their heads. A few pulled out their phones, ready to capture what they assumed would be drama worth sharing. Naomi didn't flinch. Not a muscle on her face betrayed a reaction to their slurs. She stood there, not like an accused person scrambling to prove innocence, but like someone watching a badly scripted play unfold before her eyes. "I'm exactly where I belong." Naomi's voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the grand lobby. It didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like a statement of fact, a truth that didn't require anyone's approval to exist. Charles barked out a dry, bitter laugh. "You belong here. You think just saying that makes it true?" Naomi tilted her head, her eyes lingering briefly on the name badge pinned to his chest before locking back onto his face. Calm and steady. "Do you really think I need to convince myself of that?" The question made Charles freeze for a fraction of a second. He darted a glance toward Sabrina for backup, but the receptionist could only manage a strained smirk. Naomi didn't move, didn't plead, didn't resist. Her very presence did all the talking. Tasha, the young vlogger streaming live, leaned toward Drew, whispering just loud enough for her audience to hear. "She doesn't look scared." Drew nodded, eyes fixed on Naomi. Probably because this isn't her first time dealing with this. "In the crowd," a middle-aged man muttered. "She gave them everything they asked for, and they still treat her like a criminal. This isn't protocol. This is prejudice." Naomi glanced his way, saying nothing, but the brief look was enough to silence him, not out of fear, but because he understood she knew he was right, and she didn't need to defend herself. Charles cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control. "We can do this the easy way, or the hard way." Naomi's gaze didn't waver. She spoke slowly, her voice carrying a trace of dry amusement. "By all means, try, but before you do, check whose name signs your paycheck." A ripple of murmurs swept through the lobby, like a small wave breaking against marble walls. Charles said nothing, but the way his hand gripped his tie gave him away the man had just been shoved off balance. And slowly, people were beginning to realize that Naomi's silence wasn't submission, it was power, waiting to detonate. A tall security guard emerged from a side hallway, his black shoes thudding against the marble, each step echoing through the tense air. He walked straight to the desk, his eyes on Naomi, sizing up his target. Sabrina smirked, crossing her arms with performative confidence. "This won't take long," she said to the guard, her voice dripping with thinly veiled glee. "Just escort her out." Naomi turned her head toward Sabrina, not with the look of someone about to beg, but with the kind of stare that memorizes every face in the room. In the crowd, Tasha kept her phone raised, her voice clear on the live stream. "Y'all see this? She's not doing anything. She's calm, and they're treating her like a thief." Drew, standing next to her, added, "This is the kind of thing no one believes unless they see it for themselves." Whispers ignited like fire on dry paper. Some nodded, some frowned, others discreetly raised their phones, filming from new angles. Naomi looked directly into Tasha's camera, speaking slowly, deliberately, as though addressing not the people in the lobby but the thousands watching online. "Remember this moment." The silence that followed was suffocating. Not the silence of fear, but of foreboding. Like the stillness before a storm breaks. Charles shot the guard a glance and nodded. The guard stepped forward, but Naomi's voice rang out, loud enough to command the room. "Do you even know what you're doing?" The guard hesitated, glancing back at Charles for direction. "I'm doing my job," Charles snapped. Naomi gave a small shrug, her tone dripping with quiet disdain. "Funny, doing your job is often just a nice way to dress up cowardice." A woman nearby let out a sharp "oh," followed by a bitter laugh. Her words had struck a nerve not just with him, but with many watching. Sabrina scoffed. "Say what you want. You don't belong here." Naomi turned to her, slow and deliberate. "I don't fit into the box you think I should. True, but I belong here more than anyone in this room realizes." A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. Drew muttered, "She knows something." Tasha's grip on her phone tightened, her eyes gleaming. "No, she's not just aware, she's waiting." And in that instant, even the skeptics started to understand maybe Naomi wasn't the one cornered here. Maybe she was the one who'd already set the board. Charles stepped out from behind the desk, puffing his chest like a man about to assert dominance. His voice boomed, calculated for the entire room to hear. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." It was meant to sound commanding, but carried the faint stench of desperation. Naomi didn't budge. She stood like a rooted tree, her presence unmoved, unbothered. Her eyes didn't see Charles as an authority. They saw him for what he was, a low-level employee overplaying his part in a cheap performance. "Use any way you like," Naomi said, her words slow and precise. "But before you do, check whose name signs your paycheck." It didn't sound like defiance. It sounded like a needle popping a balloon full of arrogance. Gasps erupted through the lobby. Murmurs surged like wind whipping through a canyon. Someone whistled. A guest leaned toward their companion and whispered, "What did she just say?" Drew swung the camera back to his face, eyes wide. "Did y'all hear that she's not the kind of woman you silence?" Charles clenched his jaw, forcing his face into stillness, though his whitened knuckles betrayed the pressure in his hands. Sabrina shuffled papers unnecessarily, avoiding Naomi's gaze. Even the guard paused, his resolve wavering under the weight of the shifting room. Naomi turned, slowly scanning the room, locking eyes with every face watching her. It wasn't a plea for support. It was a declaration, "I see you, and I will remember every one of you." A middle-aged woman gave her a small, knowing nod, quiet solidarity. The crowd was no longer just spectators. They were witnesses. Witnesses who could feel something bigger than a fraud check was happening here. Charles inhaled sharply, scrambling for authority. "That's enough. You don't belong here." Naomi let out a soft, almost amused laugh, the kind you give when you've heard a tired line one too many times. "That's the thing about power, Charles," she said. "It makes people forget who really owns the ground they're standing on." The room erupted with low gasps and murmurs. Tasha whispered into her live stream, though it felt like she was speaking for everyone present. "She's running this room." Naomi didn't rush. She stood still, letting the moment ripen. And then, slowly, The realization began to dawn maybe Naomi Reed wasn't the one being cornered here. Maybe the people trying to push her out were the ones already trapped. A deep, gravelly voice cut through the tension from one of the leather seats near the front desk. "She's shown her ID. That's enough." The whole lobby turned. Mr. Goldman, a longtime regular at the Aurora Grand, was on his feet, dressed in a gray suit, still holding an unfolded newspaper. He didn't shout or scowl, but every word he spoke landed like a verdict. Sabrina froze for half a second before regaining her icy composure. "This isn't your concern, sir. Please don't get involved." Her voice was pleasant, but barbed, the kind of tone honed from years of brushing off inconvenient complaints. Goldman glanced at her for a moment, then exhaled, placing his paper on the table. "If protecting this hotel now means humiliating people in public," he said, "maybe I need to reconsider why I still stay here." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Guests waiting to check in quietly set down their phones, but kept the cameras rolling. Tasha, still live streaming, whispered into her mic. "Here we go. That man just took her side." Drew added, "This isn't just bad customer service anymore. This is turning into a hearing." The room fell quieter, not out of disinterest, but because everyone wanted to hear every detail, to see exactly how this would play out. Someone quietly dragged their suitcase back, clearing space as if turning the check-in counter into a witness stand. Naomi didn't say a word. She stayed still, letting the silence and the stares do the talking. Sabrina leaned toward Charles, her voice low. "Get more security. This is slipping." Charles scowled, but as his eyes scanned the lobby, he noticed that the room he thought he controlled was slowly tilting toward the woman in the old sneakers and black t-shirt. Naomi glanced at Mr. Goldman, giving him a subtle nod. "It wasn't thanks, it was acknowledgement. I know you see this for what it is." Then she turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping across every face. "You all see what's happening here," she said. "Don't forget it." A young mother, balancing a child on her hip, snapped a photo of Sabrina blocking the counter. A man nearby hit send on a short video clip to his work group chat with the caption, "You need to see this." No one said it out loud, but everyone knew they weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses. Charles opened his mouth, then closed it again. Some moments, speaking only drags you deeper. Naomi didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to beg. Simply by existing in that space, she forced everyone to choose a side. And soon, the guests who thought they'd come for a quiet stay were realizing they had just been pulled into something much bigger than a check-in dispute. Sabrina stepped fully out from behind the counter, her heels striking the marble like hammer blows. She reached for Naomi's wrist, grabbing it like she was handling a disruptive trespasser. It wasn't painful, but it carried the message, "I decide where you belong." A sharp voice rang out from the far end of the lobby. She just grabbed her. Tasha raised her phone higher, her live stream shaking in her hand. "Y'all seeing this? She just put her hands on a guest. This is going live right now." Drew shifted to capture the scene from a wider angle. Guests started murmuring half outrage, half disbelief. Naomi didn't pull away. She let Sabrina hold her, as if granting her the chance to reveal herself fully in front of everyone. Then she lifted her eyes to meet Sabrina's, not with anger, not with pleading, but with the calm of someone holding up a mirror. "Does that make you feel powerful?" The question was soft, almost tender, but it made Sabrina snatch her hand back like she'd touched a hot stove. "Don't play the saint with me," Sabrina muttered under her breath, but loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "You don't belong here." Naomi offered a faint, knowing smile, lowering her head slightly, like she was thanking Sabrina for her honesty. "You're right," she said. "I don't fit into the box you need me to, but that has never meant I don't belong here." The room froze. A few guests started muttering under their breath. "This is abuse of power," a man in a beanie said. A young woman snapped more photos, quickly sending them off with the message, "Here." Clear evidence. Charles tried to cut in, but Naomi raised her hand slightly, a small gesture that silenced him. Enough. Her voice wasn't loud, but it landed heavy, dropping the room into stillness. You can keep doing what's familiar, but remember everyone here sees you, and they'll remember. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact, and that made Sabrina retreat behind the counter, her face flushed. Tasha whispered to Drew, though her mic caught every word. She doesn't have to fight them. She's making them collapse on their own. Drew nodded, eyes fixed on Naomi. She's not just a guest. Naomi straightened her sleeve, smoothing the fabric over her wrist like she was brushing off a bit of dust. And in that small gesture, the people closest to her began to sense this wasn't just a standoff, this was a setup. Naomi turned to the crowd, her voice low but clear, each word cutting through the air. You're all witnessing this. Don't look away. The statement pierced the invisible bubble people use to excuse themselves. This isn't my problem. A young woman with a suitcase froze, then stepped closer, aligning herself with Naomi. A middle-aged man lowered his paper completely, folding his hands over his stomach, his expression solemn. No one left. No one wanted to be just a bystander anymore. Tasha whispered into her live stream, her tone reverent. She just forced everyone to take a side. And she did it, Drew added, without raising her voice once. The air shifted. The stares weren't curious anymore. They weren't pitying. They were turning questioning, judging aimed squarely at Charles and Sabrina. Charles noticed. He tried to smile, but it came out like a cracked mask. All right, he said, grasping for authority. Leave now, or we'll... Naomi cut him off, quiet but lethal. Do you really want to finish this performance in front of all of them? A fresh ripple of murmurs surged. Someone gasped. Someone else chuckled bitterly. Tasha angled her phone to ensure every flicker of expression on Charles's face was captured. Naomi stepped toward the counter not to intimidate, but to reclaim the ground they thought belonged to them. You can throw me out, she said evenly, but you won't just be throwing out a guest. You'll be throwing out the very thing you think you're protecting this hotel's reputation. The words landed like a gavel strike. Sabrina glanced at Charles, subtly shaking her head. The guard froze in place, caught between orders and common sense. Naomi turned to the onlookers, her eyes alight not with rage, but with certainty. I stand here alone, she said, but I'm not alone anymore, because now every one of you knows exactly how wrong this is. She paused, letting the words resonate, letting the weight of them settle over the room. And as people began to realize why they couldn't look away, Naomi readied herself for the next sentence, the one that would turn the entire room into hers. Naomi turned fully toward Charles, fixing her gaze on him. It was no longer the look of an insulted guest. It was the cool, unflinching stare of someone inventorying her property, starting with the man standing in front of her. Her voice carried, clear enough that a few people behind Charles instinctively stepped back. You took my card, you took my name, and you tried to take my dignity. But there's one thing you can't take. Charles crossed his arms, smirking as if he'd just heard a joke. And what's that? Naomi didn't answer right away. She let the question hang, taut like a wire pulling tighter around the man who asked it. The crowd held its breath. Tasha lowered her phone slightly, wanting to feel the moment outside of her screen. Naomi stepped forward, not fast, but with the kind of deliberate movement that erases invisible lines. This lobby, she said, each word hitting like a hammer, this lobby is mine. A collective murmur erupted. Someone in the crowd let out an audible, "Whoa!" Drew turned to Tasha, his eyes wide. Did she just say... She said this place is hers, Tasha blurted, nearly shouting. Charles laughed, loud, performative, but hollow laughter meant more for his own nerves than anyone else's. Yours, Aurora, grand. Don't make a fool of yourself. Naomi didn't laugh. She didn't even flinch. She tilted her head slightly, like someone watching a child throw a tantrum because they couldn't accept the rules had changed. "That's right," she said softly, but every syllable landed squarely in Charles's chest. "This is my property." A sharp inhale came from the leather seats. Mr. Goldman nodded slowly, like a man confirming a long-held suspicion. A young woman raised a hand to her mouth, still recording but unable to look away from Naomi. Charles opened his mouth, but no words came. He glanced around for backup, but Sabrina kept her eyes down, busying herself with papers that didn't need organizing. The security guard pressed himself against the wall, clearly unwilling to be part of this fight. Naomi stood still, letting her words settle, letting them seep into everyone present. "You want to call me a fraud?" she continued. "Then go ahead, explain to all these people recording why a fraud owns the very place you work for." The crowd stirred. Someone pulled out their phone, whispering, "You're not going to believe what's happening here." And in that moment, everyone understood this wasn't a customer spat. This was a confrontation Charles had never been prepared to lose. The air went heavy after Naomi's words. "This lobby, it belongs to me." No clinking glasses, no rolling suitcases. Even the soft hotel music felt far away. The sentence, simple and calm, cracked open in people's minds and pressed on their chests with an almost unbearable curiosity. Tasha blinked hard but kept streaming, her voice catching on the mic. "Wait, did she just say she owns this place?" Drew leaned in close to her camera, his face almost pressed to the screen. "She did, she absolutely did." A group near the counter whispered, "She's the owner, no way, but maybe." The murmurs spread like smoke, twisting through the lobby until every glance toward Naomi carried not just curiosity, but a flicker of caution. Charles gave a dry laugh, thin, cracked, lacking any of the authority he once carried. "Yours," he repeated, almost like he was begging her to take it back. "You've got to be joking." Naomi didn't bother with explanations. She didn't need to. "I don't joke," she said, deliberate and slow. Charles looked around again, desperate for an ally. But Sabrina stared at the counter. The guard looked anywhere but at him. And the guests. They stared at him like a man standing trial. Naomi hadn't moved closer, but somehow she'd taken the whole room. "Who did you think I was when I walked through those doors?" she asked, voice sharp with quiet amusement. "Some imposter, some grifter, or just a woman who doesn't know her place?" She tilted her head, her gaze gleaming with disdain. "But there's one thing you never considered. I'm the one signing your paychecks." Gasps broke out. A mother holding her child whispered to her partner, "I knew it. She didn't look like just any guest." Tasha swiveled her camera back to Charles, narrating for the thousands watching. "This is it. The whole thing just flipped. The woman they tried to throw out. She owns this place." Charles froze, his face flushing red, but no words came. Naomi didn't fill the silence. She let it work, let it strip him down in front of everyone. And as the room teetered between shock and belief, Naomi readied her next blow, the one that would make them all realize this wasn't bravado. This was truth. Charles forced a laugh, stiff and unconvincing, the sound of a man clinging to a crumbling ledge. "You own the Aurora. That's rich." The laugh bounced off the marble, but no one joined in. It sounded less like a man in control and more like one gasping for air. Naomi didn't respond right away. She let him dangle in the quiet, her steady gaze peeling away the mask he'd worn since the start of this confrontation. "If that makes you laugh," she said softly, "then go ahead, but look around you." Charles hesitated, but Naomi gestured subtly toward the room. The truth was plain, no one was looking at him like he was in charge anymore. An older guest shook his head. "If she's not the owner, Who else would stand here like that and not be afraid? A young woman murmured to her friend, "She's not here to ask for a room. She's here to take back what's hers." Tasha's voice quivered with excitement on her live stream. "Do you see this? This isn't a stunt. This is the truth exploding in real time." "And that man," Drew added, his tone low, "just realized he picked a fight with his boss." Charles heard the murmurs. They sliced into him like paper cuts small, but countless. He turned to Sabrina, his last lifeline, but she wouldn't look at him. The guard had already retreated into the background, his hands folded neatly, eager to disappear. Naomi tilted her head, voice quiet but cutting. "I've walked into places like this before and seen your kind of look, Mr. Denton. But here's the difference. This is one place where I don't need permission to belong." Silence. No one dared break it. Naomi took a step back, not to retreat, but to stand taller in the very game she now controlled. "And now, Mr. Denton," she said, calling him by name for the first time, "choose your next words very carefully." Because everyone in the room understood whatever Charles said next wouldn't just decide his place in that lobby, it might decide his entire career. Naomi didn't say another word at first. She slipped her phone out of her coat pocket with deliberate slowness, the kind of unhurried motion that made everyone in the lobby aware she wasn't rushing. Her fingers tapped the screen, then she held it to her ear and switched to speaker. "Terminate Denton, Lowe, and Cho, effective immediately." 3 sharp beeps echoed in the marble hall, each one like a piece of metal striking stone. In an instant, Charles, Sabrina, and the security guard watched as their employee badges flickered from green to red. Just like that, the power they clung to vanished as if it had never existed. The lobby froze. Tasha gasped, momentarily forgetting she was live streaming. What just happened?" Drew pulled the phone close to his chest, zooming in on Naomi. She just fired them right here." Naomi tucked her phone back into her pocket, calm as if she'd just sent a routine text, but to everyone watching, it looked like a final verdict had been delivered. Charles blinked in shock at his badge. He pressed it to the reader beside the counter red light. An error tone blared. He tried again, harder this time. Another cold beep. What is this?" he stammered, trying to sound authoritative, but the authority was gone. Sabrina clutched her badge like it still had value. Turning toward Naomi, You can't do this." Naomi looked at her not sharply, but with a weight that made Sabrina step back. "I just did," Naomi said. Simple, final. A few guests began clapping. Not a raucous cheer, just a measured, knowing applause, the kind people give when they've witnessed something that feels deserved. Charles spun toward the crowd, searching for support, but no one saw him as a manager anymore. They saw him as a man who'd been written out of the play but hadn't realized the curtain had dropped. This is illegal," Charles barked, but the words sounded more like whining than a threat. Naomi tilted her head, smiling faintly. "If you cared that much about legality, you wouldn't have humiliated the hotel's owner in front of every single person here." A man in the crowd snorted. A young woman whispered she just stripped them down in public, completely. Naomi said nothing more. She let the silence do its work, and the silence was the sentence. But what no one knew, this execution was just the prelude. Naomi still had more pieces in play. Charles slammed his palm on the counter, the sound cracking through the lobby like a gunshot. "You can't humiliate us like this," he roared, his voice cracking with rage. Naomi turned to him, her expression so calm it made his outburst look childish. "I didn't humiliate you," she said, each word sharp and cold. "You did that yourself." It was like holding up a mirror to his face, forcing him to see himself. The crowd murmured. A few laughed quietly, not in mockery, but in recognition of an undeniable truth. Sabrina huddled behind the counter, clutching her now worthless badge. Her voice trembled. Thin as thread. I didn't know. Naomi looked at her. No pity, no rage, just a stare that made Sabrina answer her own conscience. You didn't need to know. Naomi said, slow and deliberate, you just needed to be decent. The words weren't scolding, they were judgment. A woman in the crowd shook her head. She's right. Nobody forced them to be cruel. A middle-aged man added, exactly. Kindness never cost that much. Sabrina bowed her head, silenced. Charles, still clinging to the last scraps of defiance, pointed at Naomi. You think a few phone calls fix this? This is my hotel to run, not yours. Naomi raised an eyebrow and gave a faint, knowing smile, the kind that made the crowd collectively hold its breath. Correct, she said. You ran it, but as of now, you run nothing here. It was a clean cut, a verbal guillotine severing him from the last thread of authority. The applause grew louder, then multiplied. Soon, claps rippled through the lobby, not wild celebration, but the sound of a verdict being affirmed by the public. Charles stepped back, his face flushed, but his voice gone. Sabrina dropped her badge onto the counter like it had turned to lead. Naomi didn't look at them again. She turned to the crowd, sweeping her gaze across every witness. Remember this, she said. This isn't just about me and them. It's about how every single one of you deserves to be treated when you walk through these doors. That was the moment the guests understood they weren't bystanders. They had just become part of a story Naomi was still writing. The murmurs swelled. She fired them, right in front of everyone. One guest whispered, but it carried like a headline. Drew zoomed in on Charles's face, capturing the manager staring blankly at his now useless badge. Naomi stood perfectly still, no raised voice, no triumphant gestures. Yet her silence weighed heavier than any shouting could. It wasn't the silence of avoidance, it was the silence of someone who had already won. A young woman holding a baby nodded. This is justice. Mr. Goldman folded his newspaper and watched Naomi like a man who had just witnessed a trial, public, swift, and needing no gavel. Charles turned to Sabrina, mouth opening as if to speak, but stopped when he saw tears streaming down her face. Quiet tears, the kind that come when you finally understand the cost of standing on the wrong side. A young guest still filming muttered, "This isn't just losing a job. This is being stripped of power right where they thought they owned it." Naomi walked back toward the counter calm, unhurried, not gloating. She stopped where Charles had been standing moments earlier and placed her hands lightly on the marble. "Sometimes," she said, her voice level but carrying to every corner, "justice doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be clear." No one answered, because everyone knew she was right. A man near the wall leaned over to his friend. "I'll never forget this moment." Tasha, still lived to thousands, whispered into her mic, "This is what real power looks like. Not violence, not yelling, just undeniable authority." Naomi let her words settle, then left the counter and walked to the center of the lobby. Every eye locked on her. "You've all seen it," she said, "who truly owns this place, and who only stood here because I allowed it." The whispers turned into a hum of agreement. No more doubt, no more hesitation. And just when it seemed over, Naomi's gaze swept the room one last time. "Now," she said, voice calm but loaded, "it's time you all learned the truth about what's been happening in this hotel." The air shifted. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Naomi turned fully toward the crowd now, no longer sparing a glance for Charles or Sabrina. Her voice cut through the silence, clear and unshakable. "This doesn't end with them." The words hit the room like a weight dropped from a great height. The murmurs died instantly. Phones stayed raised, But no one was recording for the drama anymore. They were documenting history. Tasha pulled Drew closer, whispering into her mic, just loud enough for the live stream to catch. What does she mean by that? Naomi stepped forward until she stood under the full glare of the grand chandelier, deliberately placing herself at the very center of this impromptu tribunal she had created. "Do you think this is just about a manager abusing his authority?" she asked, pausing only briefly before answering herself. "I wish it were that simple." Several brows furrowed. Charles stood rooted in place, hands curling into fists, sensing the quicksand forming beneath him. Naomi calmly pulled out her phone again, toggled the speaker, and set it on the counter. A woman's voice, steady and low, came through. "All the files have been opened. Hidden reports, ignored complaints. Every piece of it is documented." It was Nia, Naomi's aide. Naomi's gaze locked on Charles. These three aren't outliers. They're the product of a system that has shielded exactly the behavior you all just witnessed. The crowd stirred. A middle-aged man muttered under his breath, "A system. She's saying this goes higher than them." Naomi continued, "Do you know how many complaints like mine were brushed aside? How many incidents like today's were buried beneath fabricated reports?" She lifted the phone slightly, signaling Nia to go on. "We've recovered emails between Denton and former regional director Turner." Nia's voice rang out. "They adjusted reports to avoid investigations, intentionally discarding multiple complaints tied to discriminatory behavior and verbal abuse of guests." A collective gasp swept across the room. Tasha swung her camera toward the guests to capture their faces. Drew whispered into the mic, "This isn't a personal grievance anymore. This is blowing up an entire system." Charles clutched the edge of the counter, his face reddening. His mouth opened, ready to object, but Naomi's voice sliced through the air. "Don't bother denying it. Mr. Denton, I don't speak without evidence. And all that evidence is now backed up and sitting with the board of directors and corporate legal." Her words fell like a clean, sharp blade, severing his last hope of retort. A man in the back exhaled sharply. "She's tearing the whole house down." Naomi nodded slightly, her eyes sweeping across the room. "Exactly, and we aren't stopping at removing a few bad actors." She let that hang, letting the room brace for what was next. Nia's voice returned, firm and precise. "All archived complaints have been restored. We have documented Turner's direct involvement. This wasn't random. It was systemic favoritism and deliberate suppression." It landed like a stone crashing through still water. The crowd erupted into hushed murmurs. "So this was organized, not just random," one young man asked aloud, his voice carrying. Naomi turned to him, nodding. "Correct. This wasn't one person crossing a line. It was a chain of conduct, protected by people at the very top." Charles finally lurched forward, his voice hoarse. "Don't you dare slander me. Ms. Reed Turner isn't even here anymore, and you can't." Naomi raised a single hand. Just that, and it was enough to silence him. "Turner isn't here because he was quietly forced into early retirement after other violations came to light," she said evenly. "And you know exactly why." The room buzzed with whispers. A woman in the crowd spoke up, her tone cutting. "I filed a complaint about how they treated me last year. Never heard back." A man nearby added bitterly, "Same. They gave me some generic apology call and disappeared." Naomi took one measured step toward them, making eye contact with each speaker. "Now you know why," she said softly. "Your complaints weren't forgotten. They were buried." Her words pierced the air like steel nails, each one driving deeper than the last. Tasha's voice floated over the live stream. "Do you all see this? This isn't exposing a bad manager. This is pulling the mask off an entire machine." Charles turned as if to retreat, but the guests, once passive bystanders, shifted subtly, closing ranks to ensure he couldn't simply walk away. Naomi's tone hardened. becoming the voice of an accuser reading out charges. "We've delivered every shred of evidence to the board and legal, and we won't stop there." A younger guest muttered, his voice dripping with awe, "She's cleaning out the whole nest?" Naomi glanced at him and nodded, "That's the plan, and every step will be made public." She set her phone back on the counter, placing her hands on the cold marble like she was pressing her words into the very bones of the building. Then she spoke, slowly, each word deliberate. "Hospitality without justice isn't hospitality at all. It's just theater." The sentence landed like a hammer. It stripped away every polished smile, every empty sorry for the inconvenience, leaving only the raw truth this hotel's luxury had been propped up by a culture of neglect and discrimination. From the far side of the room, a woman holding her baby nodded deeply. "That's it," she murmured. Tasha whispered into her mic, as if narrating for history. That wasn't just a statement. That was an indictment. Charles didn't speak. His face had lost its angry flush, replaced by the pale look of a man staring into a void where his future used to be. Sabrina kept her eyes fixed on the floor, shoulders folded inward like she wished she could disappear. Naomi pressed on. "When people like me walk in here and are treated as intruders, when complaints are tossed out because they don't suit the hotel's image, those smiles at the front desk mean nothing. They're props." The silence in the lobby wasn't passive anymore. It was the hush of a courtroom after a verdict. From his corner, Mr. Goldman finally spoke. "I've stayed here for years, and today, for the first time, I've heard someone tell the truth about this place." Several people nodded, murmuring agreement. Naomi's expression softened. "And the truth is, we can do better. Not just for the highest-paying guests, not just for the ones who fit a certain mold, but for everyone who walks through these doors." The first claps started slow. Then they multiplied, filling the lobby with a steady rhythm, not wild applause, but something weightier, a confirmation. Naomi took a breath, letting the sound settle. Then she looked toward the grand entrance, her voice steady and final. "This is only the beginning." Because what came next wouldn't just change Aurora Grand. It would redefine what hospitality meant. Naomi turned toward the far end of the counter, where Ryan, the young staffer who had been silently watching. His face, a mix of worry and quiet defiance, was nervously clutching the hem of his uniform. She took a deliberate step toward him, not asking Charles's permission, not requiring a single piece of paper. "You will lead the guest experience department, effective immediately." The words landed like a spark in a dry field. Applause broke out hesitant at first, from those who had been on Naomi's side all along, then swelling, louder and steadier, until it became a wave. Ryan blinked in shock, as though questioning whether he'd heard her correctly. His lips moved without sound. Then he swallowed hard, nodded, and finally found his voice. I'll give it everything I've got." Naomi gave him a small nod, a smile just enough to steady his nerves, and just enough for those recording on their phones to understand this wasn't symbolic. Charles stood frozen, watching as the last scrap of his power was stripped away in front of an audience. Sabrina, still hovering behind the counter, shrank back when Naomi's gaze brushed over her, as if knowing her time was over too. Naomi turned back to the crowd, her voice steady but resonant. "How many of you have been ignored here before?" Hands rose hesitant at first, then more, from both guests and staff at the back of the room. Naomi let the moment stretch, letting the sight itself serve as a mirror for what Aurora Grand had become. "Starting today," she said, "anyone who has been silenced, dismissed, or treated as invisible will meet directly with Ryan and his team. No automated responses, no templated apologies, only real action." Applause erupted again, this time louder, joined by employees scattered throughout the lobby. Tasha lowered her phone slightly, whispering to Drew but loud enough for the stream to hear. She's not just tearing it down, she's rebuilding it. Naomi continued. This will no longer be a hotel only for those who fit the mold of acceptable guests. It will be a place where anyone, no matter how they arrive, is welcomed. A young mother holding her child whispered to her friend, her eyes brimming. This is what I always hoped for in a place like this. Naomi scanned the room once more, her words carrying like a seal pressed into stone. If we are going to call this a home, then it must be a home for everyone. And in that moment, those present began to understand Naomi wasn't just reclaiming dignity for herself, she was laying the foundation for a new Aurora Grand. Her eyes returned to Ryan, holding his gaze until she saw him steady himself. Then she turned to Tasha and Drew, the two who had been recording and narrating from the start, amplifying what others might have buried. Tasha, Drew. They flinched, surprised to hear their names. Naomi walked toward them, unhurried but unshakable. I want to invite you both to join Aurora Grand's Guest Advisory Council. The room shifted, an audible gasp rippled through the crowd. Tasha lowered her phone, eyes wide. Drew stammered. Us. You mean, us. Naomi nodded. You spoke up when many chose silence. Aurora Grand needs voices like yours to make sure no one ever experiences what we just witnessed. She turned back to the room, addressing everyone. And let me be clear, this is not symbolic. This is a real invitation, with authority and responsibility. A guest whispered to his companion. She's pulling them into the system itself. Naomi moved to the center of the room, every eye on her. Aurora Grand will undergo a full audit. The words were deliberate, heavy. Every buried report, every ignored complaint, every incident like today. We will reopen every single page. A middle-aged man let out a bitter laugh. Finally, someone with the guts to touch it. Naomi gave a faint nod and pressed on. If you've been silenced here or at any hotel in this chain, speak up. We will listen. No more automated responses. No more scripted apologies for the inconvenience sent to bury the truth. She gestured toward Tasha and Drew. These two will represent the voice of our guests during this process, and I promise they will have the authority to ensure your words are not buried. The applause this time was thunderous, unrestrained. Ryan bowed his head in thanks. Tasha clutched her phone, her face flushed with emotion. Drew simply grinned, shaking his head like he couldn't believe any of this was real. By the counter. Charles watched Naomi with a hollow stare. He understood now his power hadn't just been taken, it had been redistributed in front of him. Naomi addressed the crowd again. This will no longer be a place where you must fit a mold to be treated with dignity. This will be a place where everyone has a voice. And what she said next would make it clear this wasn't just a hotel reform, it was a declaration of war on an outdated way of doing business. Drew still filmed, but this time turned the camera on himself, his voice low, almost reverent. We came here for a vacation and walked into a revolution. The words carried, reaching both the live stream and the room itself. A young mother nodded, as if he'd spoken her thoughts aloud. Naomi didn't look at Drew, but the small curl of her lips showed she'd heard him. She climbed a small podium near the counter, a space once reserved for ceremonial speeches, now a platform for transformation. I know many of you are here by chance, Naomi said, her voice now reaching beyond the hotel's walls, as though aimed at anyone who had ever been dismissed. But you will carry this story far beyond these walls. The lobby went silent, not with indifference, but with the gravity of people realizing they'd just become part of something bigger. Naomi continued, And I want every hotel in this chain to hear this if you fear the truth. You have no business calling yourself part of the hospitality industry. A short, bitter laugh escaped from an older man in the back. Finally, someone said it. Tasha panned her camera across the crowd, capturing faces that no longer looked like tourists, but like witnesses. "This reform is not for marketing campaigns or glossy ads," Naomi said. "It's to ensure that when you walk through these doors, you are welcomed as a human being, not as a walking credit card." Applause thundered, this time unified, rolling like a wave. Naomi stood still, letting the sound crest and fade before speaking her final words. "And if anyone in this system thinks they can stand in the way, remember this: we are not just cleaning up a hotel, we are rebuilding a home." The applause that followed shook the room. And none of them knew yet what Naomi was about to announce next would make Aurora Grand the epicenter of a much larger conversation, far beyond these gilded walls. 3 months later. The Aurora Grand's facade no longer looked like it did under Charles's management. The gleaming glass revolving doors and the long stretches of white marble were still there, but under the gilded logo on the wall now hung a new plaque. "This place belongs to everyone who walks through these doors. No exceptions." It wasn't a marketing slogan. It wasn't a line meant to shine on a brochure. It was a commitment. And everyone knew it was real because the person who had put it there was Naomi Reed. A middle-aged woman, with 2 children in tow, stood staring at the plaque for a long moment before pushing the door open. She turned to the doorman and said, "I didn't think I'd ever come back after last time, but when I saw that sign, I thought I'd give it one more chance." The doorman didn't just bow, he smiled a genuine smile, not one from a script. Inside, the lobby wasn't just beautiful, it was alive. The reception desks no longer stood like walls of judgment. They had been lowered, opened up, inviting guests to approach without feeling like they were on trial. New staff, trained under the program Ryan and the advisory council had built, didn't wait for guests to prove they belonged. They stepped forward to greet them first. Tasha and Drew, now official members of the guest advisory council, were leading a session for new employees. Drew opened with a joke. 3 months ago, we came here to live stream our vacation. Now, we work here." The staff laughed, not the polite kind, but the kind that meant they were engaged. They were learning from people who had seen the hotel at its lowest and had helped it rise again. In the corner of the lobby, Naomi watched, quietly. Not as a flashy CEO needing to dominate the room, she wore simple clothes, the same old sneakers. But every time someone recognized her and came over, she stopped, shook their hand, and listened. The Aurora Grand had changed not just in decor or training, but in spirit, and Naomi knew this was only the beginning. She paused at the new plaque, gently touching the inscription. It wasn't just a promise to the guests. It was a reminder to everyone who ran this place: never forget why we exist. Then, as Naomi prepared to step into the boardroom to unveil her next plan, the entire board would soon learn her reform didn't stop at the Aurora Grand. It was about to spread across the entire chain and beyond. Naomi stood in the center of the redesigned lobby, where every tile, every drape kept its elegance but carried a new energy, not of exclusion, but of genuine welcome. Around her, guests and employees fell silent, waiting. She didn't stand on a podium, she didn't use a microphone, and yet her voice carried. Hospitality does not begin with a smile. It begins with the respect you give someone by default. Her words weren't hollow greetings, they were a mirror, reflecting everything that had once been wrong here. A few people nodded. Some longtime guests exchanged knowing looks, as if silently acknowledging that the Aurora Grand truly was different. Ryan stood at the counter in a redesigned uniform, simpler but elegant, no longer coded to signal hierarchy. Beside him, new employees greeted guests with open, direct eyes, no judgment, no weighing of who deserved to be here. An older woman approached the counter. Ryan welcomed her with, "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can we make your stay more comfortable today?" Not the stiff, scripted, "Do you have a reservation but a genuine offer of care?" The woman smiled, as though surprised to be truly heard. Naomi continued, "I don't want the Aurora Grand to be just a hotel. I want it to be a place where everyone who walks through these doors knows they belong." The crowd began to applaud, but Naomi raised a hand to quiet them. "And I don't say this to make anyone feel good. This is a commitment all of us must keep." From the side, Tasha whispered to Drew, her mic catching every word. "It's like she's not just talking to them. She's talking to the whole industry." Drew nodded, eyes fixed on Naomi. "She is, and they're going to have to listen." Naomi took a step back, scanning the faces in the room from guests filming on their phones to new employees clenching their hands like they were making silent promises to themselves. "This is not a speech. This is a beginning." She smiled softly. "And if any of you still doubt, stay and watch what we do next." Because what Naomi was about to announce would make it clear this wasn't just the reform of one hotel, it was a redefinition of how an entire industry treated human beings. Naomi stepped out of the lobby toward the tall glass doors where the Seattle rain painted the streets in silver streaks. Outside, the city moved at its usual hurried pace, people under umbrellas, yellow taxis rushing by, the distant blare of horns. It reminded Naomi of herself years ago, a woman standing outside doors like these, unsure if she was worthy of walking in. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the cold glass, the sensation pulling old memories back. Times she had stood for hours outside other hotels, carrying an invisible weight of shame. Back then, she believed she just needed to work harder to be accepted, but she now understood the problem was never that she wasn't enough. The problem was a system designed to keep people like her out. Naomi turned back to look at the plaque. "This place belongs to everyone who walks through these doors, no exceptions." For the first time in years, she saw a promise not to reassure customers, but to remind herself of the journey that had brought her here. Ryan approached with a folder in hand, but Naomi signaled for him to wait. He understood, stepping back to give her this moment. "I used to be the one standing outside doors like these," Naomi murmured, her voice just loud enough for a few nearby staff to hear. "And now, I'll do everything I can to make sure no one else ever has to." A young staffer nearby blinked back tears. Quickly bowing her head, Drew, still recording, whispered to Tasha. "She's not just talking about hotels. She's talking about how we see each other." Tasha nodded, eyes fixed on Naomi. "And she makes it sound like a mission, not a motto." Naomi let her hand fall from the glass and turned toward the lobby, where people bustled with purpose, not just employees or guests, but people building something bigger together, a true home. She took a deep breath, returning to her calm composure before heading to the boardroom. Inside, the directors were waiting, and Naomi knew she was about to give them a choice: stand with the change or be left behind. Because what she was about to unveil wouldn't just shape the Aurora Grand's future, it would set a new standard for the entire hospitality industry. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.